Miramah sighed. Fine, we can go now. Smoothing her long kaftan, the princess rose to her feet and, with a swinging stride, trod down the garden path. Hesna Khatun watched her quietly for a while. Then, as soon as Miramah was out of earshot, she spoke, in a tone so soft and so caring that Jahan did not grasp the chiding underneath until the nursemaid, too, was gone. Hyacinth eyes. Milk brother to an elephant. You are a strange one, Indian. Or else a gifted liar. If that's right, if you are deceiving my good and gracious Excellency, I swear I'll find it out and make you regret it. The next time they came to see the elephant, the nursemaid was 7 steps behind and silent as a corpse. As for the princess, Jahan thought that, in the receding light of the late afternoon, she looked more beautiful than ever before. On her finger shone a diamond, the size of a walnut and the color of pigeon's blood. Jahan was aware that if he could only get his hands on it, he would be a rich man all his life. And yet, somehow, he also knew he could never steal from her. After feeding Chota dried prunes, she sat under the lilac tree. A faint odor of flowers and wild herbs wafted from her hair. I'd like to hear what happened afterwards. Jahan felt a shiver run down his entire body, but he managed to say, calmly, as you wish, Your Highness. The story the Mahout told the princess. About a year after Chota was born, Shah Humayun received an unusual visitor in his magnificent palace, an Ottoman admiral who had lost half of his crew and all of his fleet in a terrible storm. After listening to his ordeals, the Shah promised the man a new caravel so that he could return home. I set sail to fight the heathen, said the Ottoman. But a gale brought me to this land. I now understand why. Allah wished me to witness the Shah's generosity and to convey this to my Sultan. Pleased to hear this, Humayun rewarded the admiral with robes and jewels. Afterwards he retired to his private chambers, and it was there, in a bathtub full of rose petals, that an idea occurred to him. His troubles were endless, his enemies aplenty, including his own flesh and blood. His late father had given him some hard advice: do not harm your brothers even though they may well deserve it. How could he fight them without harming them, Humayun wondered. And if he did not defeat them, how could he remain in power? There he was, as naked as the hour in which he was born, drained by the steam, contemplating this quandary, when a rose petal caught his eye. Swimming gracefully, it slid towards him as if guided by an invisible hand and fastened itself to his chest. Gentle by birth, mystical by disposition, Humayun gasped. Surely this was an omen. The rose petal had shown him his weakest side, his heart. He ought not to be enfeebled by his feelings. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed that the shipwrecked captain had been brought to him just like this petal. God was telling him to wage war on his enemies and, if necessary, to get support from the Ottomans. He left the bath, delighted and dripping. Between the two Muslim sultanates there were sporadic exchanges. Merchants, emissaries, mystics, spies, artisans, and pilgrims traveled to and fro. Also, gifts. The last came in all sizes: silks, jewels, carpets, spices, mother-of-pearl cabinets, musical instruments, lions, cheetahs, cobras, concubines and eunuchs. From one ruler to the other, messages were carried along with tokens of largesse, and the answer, whether affirmative or not, would arrive with reciprocal flamboyance. Humayun, giver of peace and the shadow of God upon earth, was curious about Sulayman, swayer of sea and land and the shadow of God upon earth. He had heard from his spies that every night before he went to sleep the Sultan wore the seal of Solomon, the signet ring that had given his namesake command over animals, humans, and jinn. Sulayman's strengths were apparent. But what were the foibles and the fears that festered under those precious kaftans, each of which he was rumored to wear but once? Humayun had also heard about Hurrem, the queen of Sulayman's harem. Recently she had ordered 1,000 pairs of turtle doves from Egypt that had been trained as carriers, tiny papers wrapped around their claws. The birds had been sent to Istanbul over seas and rivers, and when they were released, the sky above turned as black as pitch and the people ran to the mosques, fearing the day of judgment. Humayun decided to impress the Ottoman Sultana with a matchless present. His offering would honor the Sultan but at the same time remind him of the lands beyond his reach and, thus, of his limits. Swathed in a cape, the Shah called for his ewer-bearer, Jawahar, in whose wisdom he trusted. "Tell me, what would be the right gift to send to a man who has everything?" Jawahar replied, "Not silks or gems, nor gold or silver. I'd say, an animal. Because animals have personalities and each is different. Which animal would best convey to him the greatness of our empire?" "An elephant, my lord. The biggest animal on land." Shah Humayun gave this some thought. "What if I'd like to imply that my kingdom, though splendid enough to have such an elephant, is in need of his help? In that case, my lord, send him a baby elephant. It'll be our way of saying that we cannot do battle just yet. We need a helping hand. But we shall grow and fight, and when we fight, we shall triumph, God willing." The morning Jawahar arrived with a regiment of soldiers. Jahan was feeding Chota, now weighing almost 8 kantars and still the color of ivory. Jahan's uncle, delighted to have such a respectable guest in his courtyard, bowed and scraped. "Our noble Shah's noble servant, how can I be of help?" "I heard you had a white elephant," Jawahar said. "You must give it to us. The Shah wishes to send it to the Ottomans." "Of course, what an honor." "You're not giving Chota away, are you?" came a voice from behind. Everyone turned to look at Jahan. His uncle threw himself on the ground. "Forgive him, venerable master. His mother passed away last month. Awful disease. She was fine one day, gone the next. She was with child, poor thing. The boy doesn't know what he's saying. Grief got into his head. Mother died because of your cruelty. You beat her every day." Slapped by his stepfather, Jahan tumbled down, unable to finish his words. "Don't hit your son," said Jawahar. "I am not his son," yelled Jahan from where he had fallen. Jawahar smiled. "You are a brave boy, aren't you? Come closer. Let me look at you." Under the burning gaze of his uncle, Jahan did as he was told. "Why don't you wish to let go of the animal?" asked Jawahar. "Chota is like no other elephant, he's different. He can't go anywhere." "You love the beast, that's good," said Jawahar. "But he'll be fine. In the Ottoman palace he'll be treated like a prince. And your family will be rewarded." The Shah's ewer-bearer then gestured to a servant who, out of his robe, produced a pouch. Jahan's uncle's eyes glinted when he saw the coins. He said, "Don't mind the lad, my lord. What does he know? The calf is yours. Do with him as you wish." Once Chota's fate was sealed, Jahan took it upon himself to make the elephant ready for his long journey. He fed him remedial herbs that would ease digestion, washed and oiled and perfumed his skin, trimmed the pads under his feet, clipped his nails, all the while knowing that it wasn't he who would be accompanying Chota when the time came to climb aboard. A mahout, 5 years older and supposedly experienced, had been appointed for the task. A stumpy youth with a protruding chin and close-set eyes. He was called Gurub, a name the boy would never forget. One did not forget the name of one's enemy. A massive cage was sent from the palace, its corners welded in gold and silver, its bars adorned with flowers and tassels. Upon seeing it, Jahan's eyes brimmed over. Chota, frisky and of good cheer since the day he was born, would be kept in chains and put under lock and key like some common criminal. Try as he might to accept that this was the only way the animal could go by water, he could not bear the thought. Withdrawing into misery, he ate and spoke little. His sisters were worried, even his uncle left him alone. Gurub dropped round every now and then to see how things were coming along and, as he put it, to make familiar with the beast. Jahan watched him like a hawk, and his heart warmed when the elephant paid his new mahout no heed. "Hold this!" Gurub would shout, lifting the cane in his hand. Chota would stay put, not even glancing at him. "Come, grab this stick!" Jahan would yell from another corner and the elephant would veer towards him, ever so obedient. A few times the two youngsters had come close to exchanging blows. Even so, since Chota listened to no one save Jahan, to make things easy it was agreed that the boy would travel with them to the port of Goa. There, the elephant would be loaded onto the vessel that would take him to Istanbul, and Jahan would return to Agra. The morning they set off, Jahan's eldest sister pulled him aside. Inhaling ever so slowly, she held her breath deep down in her lungs, not yet ready to let go either of her breath or of her brother. "You are leaving," she said, as if it needed to be announced. "I'll help Chota and come back with uncle," said Jahan, putting into his sack the bread she had baked. "Just for a few days. The road can be short or long, who knows? This morning I asked myself, if mother were here, what would she counsel you? I prayed to God that he would let me know so that I could tell you, but nothing came." Jahan kept his head down. He, too, wanted to know what his mother would have told him had she been alive. When he looked outside, he saw the elephant glowing. The peasants had painted his trunk in swirling colors and embellished his mantle with sequins. As he watched him, these words spilled from Jahan's mouth: "Be kind to the beast, and to the weak," she might have said. His sister's eyes, which had been dark and doleful, now lit up. "That's right. Whatever you do," she would have said, "don't hurt anyone and don't let anyone hurt you. Be neither a heartbreaker nor heartbroken." The clouds above the port of Goa rolled away across the pewter sky, bringing them the favorable wind they had been awaiting for days. The anchors were raised, the sails were hoisted, a pair of old and torn breeches was thrown into the water to expel bad luck. Gurub was rigged out in an embroidered jacket the color of dead leaves. Next to the tatters Jahan wore, his clothes shone like a Maharaja's. Scowling at the boy, Gurub said, "You better take yourself off. We don't need you anymore. Not going anywhere until the ship leaves." "You brat," Gurub said. Jahan pushed him. Caught unawares, Gurub tumbled down, soiling his jacket. He stood up and hissed, "I'll kill you." Jahan dodged the blows with ease, savvy about how to protect himself. Thanks to the training of his uncle, who was watching the brawl from one side. Amused. Being taller and older, Gurub could have roughed him up, but he didn't. He had seen the madness in the boy's eyes, that brittle savagery. For him, Chota was but one elephant among many. For Jahan, he was like no other, his best friend, his milk brother. Plague upon thee, Gurub said, but he had already stopped fighting. Still shaking, Jahan went to Chota. Just standing beside him deepened the sadness creeping into his heart. He said, "Fare you well, my brother." The elephant, now shackled, swung his trunk. "You're going to be fine. The Sultan will welcome you and the Sultana will adore you, by my troth." And with those words the boy strode away, wiping his tears, though he could not go far. On impulse he hid behind a wall to spy. After a while, Gurub returned, having cleaned his jacket. Confident that he had got rid of his rival, he scoffed, big beast. From now on it's you and me. If you don't obey me, I'll starve you to death." Getting the elephant onto the vessel would be no mean feat. Chota had not even glanced at his cage. When the moment came, Gurub instructed the elephant to move, a command that went ignored. He smacked the elephant with his cane. Chota didn't budge. Gurub hit him again. Jahan's mind began churning. If he entrusted his milk brother to this ogre, the elephant might not make it alive to the Ottoman lands. By now, the Colossi had finished loading the freight into the ship. Chota and his cage were among the last items on the dock. Upon Gurub's call, 4 men appeared and tied ropes around Chota's torso. Not liking this at all, the elephant trumpeted and rumbled. Though not yet a year old, he was strong. The 4 men became 10, half pushing half pulling in unison. As soon as the elephant was shoved into the cage, the iron door was shut and bolted. Chota turned back slowly, a painful look in his eyes, only now understanding that he was trapped. The cage was fastened with chains from above and hoisted with the help of a tackle. Chota, already in mid-air, stared about, not at anyone in particular but towards the distant lush forests and the misty valleys where elephants plodded along, free and reckless. It was then that something caught Jahan's eye. Ahead of him a crate lay on the ground. Some of its planks had peeled off, leaving an opening through which he could see its contents, parcels wrapped in cloth. They would carry this to the ship at the end. He glanced at the elephant, he glanced at the crate. Making sure no one was watching, Jahan sneaked into the half-filled crate. His lips curved into a smile at the thought of his uncle searching everywhere for him. He waited, still as a stone. After an eternity, he felt a jolt, a bounce that jarred every bone in his body. The porters were carrying him, and not as gently as he had hoped. As the crate was thrust aside with a thump, he knocked his head against the timber. He was on board. The carrack in which he found himself was named the Glowing Sun. She had 4 masts, and large castles fore and aft. On the main mast, where some sunburned sailors sat inside the crow's nest, were bonnets that could be added depending on the wind's whim. There were 78 seamen. In addition, there were a small number of missionaries, pilgrims, emissaries, merchants and gadabouts. Jahan was careful not to go out in broad daylight. As soon as the rays of light on the floorboards receded, he crept out and searched for the elephant. It didn't take him long to find him. He was on the other side of the hold, which was horribly dark and damp. The mahout was nowhere to be seen. When he noticed the boy, Chota made a sweet, chirping noise. Jahan sat next to the animal, telling him he would make sure he arrived in Istanbul safe and sound, and that only then would he return to his sisters. The next morning, his stomach empty as a dry well, Jahan was up on the deck. From a sailor who had no idea who he was and didn't much care, he managed to get some water and bread. On the way back he visited Chota. He was alone. Again. Gurub, apparently, had no intention of spending time inside the hold. Emboldened, Jahan began to visit Chota more often, until he was caught. "You," a familiar voice roared. Jahan turned around to find Gurub by the entrance, his eyebrows arched into the middle of his forehead. "Damn you! Why are you here? Why are you not here? Every time I come Chota is alone. Hang thee! What is it to you? It's the Sultan's damn beast. Not yours." They kept shouting at each other, though neither seemed willing to come to blows. The sailors came running at the commotion and took them to the captain. A swarthy man with a penchant for opium and high-heeled leather boots, which clattered as he paced about. "One elephant, 2 tamers," the captain said. "One of you is too many." "I was chosen for this task," Gurub said. "He's only a boy. I care for the animal. He doesn't." Jahan inveighed. "Quiet," the captain said. "I'll decide who goes, who stays." He never did. Day after day, Gurub and Jahan waited in suspense, avoiding each other, watching over the elephant in shifts. They were treated well, surviving on contributions of salted meat, biscuits, hardtack, and beans. Chota, however, unhappy with his diet and with the atmosphere in the hold, lost weight day by day. The sailors were a superstitious lot. There were words you should never utter, for they invited bad luck. Sink, for instance, or rocks or disaster. You should not say storm, even if you found yourself in the midst of one. If you heard the chant of mermaids, you ought to throw a pinch of salt behind your left shoulder, because it was the devil calling. The crew had incantations, which they repeated. Often, they whistled, though never at night, and whenever they heard something they disliked, they spat and stomped their feet. Certain things they regarded as harbingers of doom: upside-down buckets, tangled ropes, bent nails, and pregnant women on board. Jahan was surprised to learn they were fond of rats. Since the rodents were known to abandon a ship bound to go down, their presence was a warm assurance that everything was fine. Yet when a crow landed on one of the masts, it was cursed and chased away. One of the sailors explained to the boy that he had gone to a sorcerer before they raised anchor and had bought 3 auspicious winds for the journey. He would have liked to purchase more, he said, but this was all he could get for his silver coin. Nonetheless, one afternoon the rats disappeared. The sky, a blameless blue, turned black. Shortly afterwards came that which should never be said out loud. Rain pelted down in buckets, cloudbursts hit them full in the face, and the waves, getting higher every passing minute, began to spill onto the deck. The storm sails could not be raised. The rudder, broken down, was swept away. It is the end, Jahan thought. Little did he know that it was, though only for him and the elephant. On the 3rd day of the storm, a group of sailors descended the stairs to the hold. One glance at their grim faces and Jahan felt his blood chill. The beast must go," said one man through half-closed lips. "We should never have had him on board," butted in his chum. "White elephant. Dark omen. It's all his doing. You think we brought on the storm? Are you out of your minds?" Jahan said. But his words were muffled by the sailors' grumbling. No one was listening to him. Helpless, the boy turned to Gurub. "Why don't you do something?" "What can I do?" Gurub answered with a shrug. "Go talk to the captain." Out and up dashed Jahan. It was hell on the deck. Seething, swelling, the sea slapped them from all directions. Drenched and dizzy, holding onto the rails so as not to be swept away, Jahan found the captain barking orders. Grabbing him by the arm, he begged him to come downstairs and appease his men before they harmed the elephant. The boys re-rattled. The captain said, "They don't want a white elephant on board. Don't blame them. So you're going to throw us into the water?" The captain gawked at the boy as though the possibility had never occurred to him. "You can stay," he said. "The creature goes. I can't let Chota drown. He can swim. In this weather." Jahan shouted on the verge of crying. A new thought came to him, a glimmer of hope. What do you think Sultan Suleiman will say when he learns what you've done to his gift? Better the wrath of the Sultan than the seas. You say it's bad luck to have a white elephant on board. What will happen if you kill it? That's bigger bad luck. Chewing his mustache, the captain said, "I'll give you a boat. There's an island not far off. You'll be fine." A rowboat was lowered. Gurub and Jahan stared at it wide-eyed. "Jump in," said the captain. "Hey, I got nothing to do with the elephant," said Gurub. "It's not mine." "Well," the captain turned to Jahan. "How about you?" The boy did not feel he was making a decision so much as accepting a decision that had already been made for him. Without a word he stepped into the rowboat, scared witless. "It's like the story of the Prophet Solomon," said the captain before another wave smashed onto the deck. Two women claim to be mother to the same baby. The fake one says, "Split him into two." But the true mother won't agree to that. See, now we know who is the real Mahout, and who is the impostor. Chota was brought up to the deck, wild with fear. His feet kept slipping on the wet boards. After a few attempts they gave up trying to move him into the boat and shoved him into the sea. He fell down with an ear-splitting squeal. The water, dark and furious, opened its mouth and swallowed the animal as if he were a mere empty shell. When Jahan stopped talking, he saw that Princess Miramah was staring at him in horror. She asked, "How did you survive?" "We were washed ashore on an island. From there we were saved by another ship," he replied. Behemoth was the name. She gave a smile of relief. "Were they nice to the elephant?" "No, Your Highness. They were horrible. The sailors got sick midway. Scurvy. The worst kind. Someone said elephant flesh was the cure. They almost killed Chota. Captain Gareth saved us. We owe our lives to him. The rest, you already know. We arrived in Istanbul and were brought here." "Pity, your tale has ended," said Miramah with a sigh. "If you had kept talking for another 1,000 days, I would have listened without cease. I was fond of daydreaming about your feats." Jahan felt awful when he realized how stupid he had been to finish the story. He could have made it much longer. What if the princess left now and never came back? He began to panic. Just as he was cudgeling his brains for another way to continue with the tale, he heard a sudden wheezing and hacking. Hesna Khatun was bending down, her face suffused with red, her breath coming out in ragged gasps. She was having an asthma attack. The princess and the Mahout, each giving her an arm, walked her to the tree and helped her to sit down. Deftly, Miramah pulled out a pouch tucked in the nursemaid's sash, opened it and brought it to the woman's nose. A sharp odor pervaded the air. So this was it? Jahan thought. The smell he had picked up on the princess, time and again, was from the wild herbs the nursemaid carried with her everywhere. Meanwhile, the woman was inhaling deeply. Bit by bit, her breathing calmed. "Let's go, Miramah said. "We shouldn't tire you." "Yes, Serene Highness," the woman responded, as she arranged her headscarf and rose. Mirama turned to the elephant and said, in a tone of tenderness, "So long, Chota. You've gone through so much, poor thing. Next time I shall bring you the best treats in the palace." She added with a swift sideways glance, "I am glad you did not leave the elephant alone, Hyacinth boy. That was so kind of you." "Your Majesty," Jahan said, but could not continue. Just then she did something he could never have imagined her doing, not in 100 years. She touched him. Placing a hand on his face, she pressed lightly on his cheek, as if searching for the single dimple that was now hiding behind a blush of embarrassment. "You have a good heart, Mahout. I wish we could spend more afternoons together." Dazed and smitten by her affection, Jahan could not move, could not breathe, let alone utter a word of gratitude. There was no time to rejoice or to invent new stories. Once again all he could do was to watch her leave him and wonder if she would ever come back. "Hey, Mahout, where the hell are you?" Jahan went to see who was yelling outside his shed. It was the chief white eunuch, arms akimbo. "Where were you?" "I was cleaning." "Go get ready. The Grand Mufti needs the beast." What for?" Carnation Camel Aga took a step forward and slapped him on the face. "What are you asking? Do as I say." With the help of the tamers, Jahan fastened the howdah on the elephant's back. When Chota was ready, the eunuch gave them a look that bordered on contempt. "Off you go. Sangram will show you the way. A heretic is on trial." "Yes, Effendi," said Jahan, though he didn't have a clue what that meant. It was a drizzling, bustling Friday morning. Jahan and Sangram, sitting inside the howdah, plodded along through the hilly streets. What the chief white eunuch refused to reveal, Jahan was able to extract from Sangram. Their task was to collect the Grand Mufti and carry him to a square where he would question a Sufi preacher famed for his impious views. That a royal elephant had been assigned to the service of the chief religious officer was the Sultan's way of showing his support for the ulama. The Sultan himself was not attending the court case, and had turned down the Grand Mufti's invitation, an indication that he wished to give a wide berth to theological debates. As they were passing by the ancient graveyard that overlooked the Golden Horn, the elephant stopped abruptly. Jahan prodded him with his cane, but the animal stood transfixed. "I heard a strange thing about these beasts," said Sangram. "They say they choose where they'd like to die. This one seems like he has found his place." "What are you saying?" "Chota is an infant," Jahan objected, disturbed by the words he had heard. Sangram shrugged. Thankfully, Chota began to walk again, and the subject was dropped as quickly as it had started. Before noon they arrived at the Grand Mufti's house, a mansion with a dovecot carved in limestone, a pergola topped with a bald achin and cantilevered bay windows overseeing the Bosphorus. Jahan inspected the place with interest. He noticed that the windows mostly faced north and a few had stained glass, which he thought was a pity, since they did not capture the changing light. It occurred to him that if he could filch paper from somewhere, he could draw this place in the way he was imagining it. Meanwhile the Grand Mufti appeared. Jahan saluted him under the eyes of his wives and children, who, having never seen an elephant before, were peeking from behind curtains and doors. With the help of a ladder and a dozen servants, the old man took his seat inside the howdah. Jahan, as usual, sat on Chota's neck. Sangram would walk. "Has anyone ever toppled down from up here?" the Grand Mufti yelled when they set off. "Chalebai, I can assure you that has never happened. Inshallah, I won't be the first. To Jahan's surprise, the aged man handled the ride well enough. They trudged along the wider streets, avoiding any alleyways too narrow for the elephant. Besides, Jahan had the impression that the Grand Mufti wanted to be seen by as many people as possible. One didn't get a chance to mount Sultan Sulayman's elephant every day. They entered the square, where a crowd awaited them, waving and hailing. People greeted them, although who was more heartily welcomed, Chota or the Grand Mufti, was hard to say. There was excitement in the wind, an anticipation for a remarkable spectacle. After being carried down, the Grand Mufti proceeded to lead the Friday prayer, followed by the ulama and hundreds of townsmen. Jahan and Sangram waited by the elephant's side, whispering. Every now and then they glanced furtively at the spot where 4 husky soldiers stood guard. Among them, praying on his own, now getting on his knees, now standing up, was a stranger, a tall, lithe figure with a delicate face and a few days of stubble. Sangram said his name was Layla, yet everyone called him Majanun Sheikh. He was the youngest of Sufi scholars, the youngest of Friday preachers. He had eyes the pale gray of autumn rain, freckles like dots of paint, hair fluffy and fair. He was a man of mesmerizing contrasts, a child's curiosity in the inner workings of the world and a sage's unruffled wisdom, brave to the point of recklessness, but diffident, full of vigor yet surrounded by an air of melancholy. Good with words, proficient in Marifa *, his sermons were popular, attended by both believers and doubters from all over the empire. His voice, soft and soothing, gained a lisping lilt whenever he became particularly emotional. His teachings dazed, dismayed, and disturbed the ulama. The dislike was mutual. Not a day passed without Majanun Sheikh needling or ridiculing religious officialdom. When one reaches a higher awareness, he said, one need not pay attention to haram and halal as much as to the inner core of faith. The Sufis, having attained an upper level of understanding, were not bound by the decrees of the ulama. Those were invented for the masses, for those who did not want to think, and who expected others to think for them. Majanun Sheikh spoke about love, of God and of fellow human beings, of the universe in its entirety and of the tiniest particle. Prayer should be a declaration of love, and love should be stripped of all fear and expectation, he said. 1. Ought not fear boiling in cauldrons or wish for virgin houris, since both hell and heaven, suffering and joy, were right here and right now. How long were you going to shrink from God, he asked, when you could, instead, start to love him? His followers, a motley collection of artisans, peasants, and soldiers, listened to his oration spellbound. His ideas appealed to the impoverished, his manners to the rich. Even women, they said, even ignorant odalisques and resentful eunuchs, set great store by him, even Jews, Christians, and the Zoroastrians, who had a book no one had yet seen. The Friday prayer came to an end, the scholars settled down. Majanun Sheikh pressed on his eyes, like a kid rubbing the sleep out of them, and studied, one by one, his interrogators. Do you know what you are being accused of? Asked the Grand Mufti. What you call heresy, he answered. But the charge is unfounded. We'll see about that. Is it true you've declared you are God and everyone is God? What I said was the Creator is present in each person. Whether a farrier or a pasha, we share the same lifeblood as of yore. How is that possible? We are made not only in his divine image but also with his divine essence. Is it true that you said you have no fear of God? Why should I fear my beloved? Do you fear your loved ones? A murmur rose from the crowd. Someone shouted, silence. So you accept that you have claimed to resemble God. You think God is similar to you. Angry, rigid, eager for revenge. Whereas I say, instead of believing that the worst in humans can be found in God, believe that the best in God can be found in humans. One scholar, Ebu Suud Effendi, asked permission to break in. Are you aware that what just passed your lips is pure blasphemy? Was it? Majnun Sheikh paused, as if briefly considering the likelihood. A shadow crossed Ebu Suud's face. Instead of feeling remorse, you seem to be scoffing at the High Court. Your mind is warped, clearly. I was not mocking. Besides, we are not that different, you and I. Whatever you hate in me, does it not also exist in you? Certainly not. We couldn't be more different, Ebu Suud said. And your God is surely not the same as mine. Oh, but are you not committing shirk, talking of my God and your God as if there could be more than one God? The crowd rippled with whispers. Coughing, the Grand Mufti broke in, tell us more about God, then. Majnun Sheikh's response to this was that Allah was not a king or Raja or Padishah sitting on his celestial throne, watching from above, writing down every sin so that he could punish when the day arrived. God is not a merchant. Why should he calculate? God is not a clerk, why should he scribble? Not liking this answer, the court went on interrogating him from all sides. Each time they got similar responses. Finally they heard these words from the accused, where you draw a line and tell me to stop, that is only the beginning. For me, what you call haram is to me pure halal. You say I have to shut my mouth, but how can I keep silent when God speaks through me? Dusk fell, the sky turned into a crimson mantle above the hills. Far in the distance the lantern of a passing boat shone dimly. Seagulls screeched, fighting over a piece of rotten meat. People got bored, as the excitement of the previous hours began to wear thin. They had tasks to complete, bellies to fill, wives to please. Gradually, the audience melted away. Only the adherents of the heretic remained, their devotion visible in their expressions. We give you a last chance, said the Grand Mufti. If you admit you have been speaking sacrilegiously about God and swear to never say such obscenities again, you might be forgiven. Now tell me, once and forever, do you repent? What for? Said Majnun Sheikh, his shoulders straightening as he seemed to take a decision. I love the beloved as the beloved loves me. Why feel remorse? For love? Surely there are other things to rue. Avarice, ruthlessness, deception. But love ought not to be regretted. In his anxiety Jahan did not notice that he was pulling Chota's reins too tightly. The elephant made a sound of discomfort, which drew everyone's attention. This creature, said Majnun Sheikh, regarding Chota with something akin to admiration. Is that not testimony to the beauty and variety of the universe? See how it reflects all existence, even though some may say it's no more than a beast. When we die our soul passes from one body to another. There's no death. Therefore, no heaven to await, no hell to dread. I do not need to pray 5 times a day or fast the entire Ramadan. For those who have ascended high enough, the rules of the common people are of little account. Silence fell and lengthened into an awkward wait. Into this the Grand Mufti declared, let it be known that the accused was given a chance to see the error of his ways. He has decided his own end. He shall be put to death 3 sunsets. Hence, all his followers will be arrested. Those who repent of their sins will be spared. The rest will meet the same fate. Jahan lowered his gaze, unable to watch any more. He was startled when he heard the elephant being mentioned again. Should the Grand Mufti allow me, I have an idea, said Ebu Suud Effendi. As you know, the people of Istanbul love our Sultan's white elephant. Why not have the renegade die under the beast's feet? No one would forget this. The Grand Mufti looked puzzled. That has never been done before. My lords, they exercise this punishment in the lands of Hindustan. Thieves, murderers, rapists are often trodden on by elephants. It has proved effective. Let the elephant trample on him and make of him an example for those who hold similar views. The Grand Mufti was pensive for a moment. He said, I don't see why not. With that, all heads turned towards Jahan and Chota. The Mahout opened his mouth but could not speak for panic, at first. His heart thudding, he then managed to say, I beg you, esteemed scholars. Chota has never done a thing like that. He wouldn't know what to do. Don't you come from the land of Hindustan? Asked Ebu Suud Effendi suspiciously. Jahan paled. Yes, I do, Effendi. The Grand Mufti said the final word. Well, then, teach him. You have 3 days. 3 days after the trial, shaking like a leaf in a gust of wind, Jahan was sitting atop the elephant, staring down at the sea of spectators. His eyes flicked between them and the man lying supine on the ground, only an arm's length away. Majnun Sheik's hands and feet were tied, as were his eyes. He was praying in soft tones that were swallowed by the clamor of the crowd. Go, Chota! Jahan yelled, his command devoid of strength. The elephant didn't budge. Move, you beast! Jahan prodded the elephant with a stick, then a wooden cudgel. He uttered threats and curses, offered nuts and apples. None of it worked. When Chota did finally care to move, instead of stamping on the convict, he took a step back and waited, flicking his ears nervously. The jurists, seeing that the public was getting bored, changed the verdict at the last moment. The heretic and his followers were to be killed in the traditional way. In the end, Majnun Sheikh and his 9 disciples were executed by hanging. Their bodies were dumped into the Bosphorus. The last disciple, the one who had escaped because he had been traveling at the time of the trial, waited at the bay where the land jutted into the sea. He knew the tides of the Bosphorus would bring him the bodies. One by one, he fetched them, cleaned them, kissed them, buried them. Unlike all other Islamic graves in Istanbul, theirs would be without headstones. From the moment he arrived in the menagerie, Jahan expected Sultan Suleiman to inquire about the elephant. But weeks, then months passed without any sign of the sovereign. He was either on a battlefield or on his way to one. On those rare occasions when he stayed in the palace, he was wrapped up in affairs of the state. If not in the entanglements of the harem. Jahan kept waiting for the Sultan to come. Instead it was the Sultana who turned up one afternoon. Quick as the wind and quiet as a cat after a pigeon, she caught him unawares. 1 minute the garden was empty and the next she was there, her entourage waiting demurely 7 steps behind her. She wore a scarlet petticoat trimmed with ermine, a headdress with tassels that accentuated her sharp chin and an emerald larger than the egg of some queer fowl on her middle finger. There, behind the erect figure of her mother, apart from everyone and everything, was Princess Mirama, gauzy scarves dangling from her headdress. Ruddy and radiant, sparkles of sunlight dancing in her hair. Her eyes, glossy like pebbles at the bottom of a creek, lit up as they caught his admiring gaze. Her lips, twisted in a smile, revealing the gap between her two front teeth, which gave her face a mirthful, impish appearance. Jahan opened and closed his mouth as if unbeknown to him his tongue wished to speak to her. He was almost going to take a step in her direction when a eunuch slapped him on his neck. "Kneel down. How dare you?" Startled, Jahan bowed so low and so fast that his knees knocked against the stones. A giggle ran through those present that made him blush up to his ears. Ignoring the scene, Hurrem walked past, her skirts brushing Jahan's forehead. "Who looks after this beast?" she asked. "I do, my sultana," Jahan said. "What's the beast's name?" "Chota, your highness." "What can he do?" Jahan found the question so bizarre it took him a moment to answer. He's a noble animal." He wished to tell her, if he only could, elephants were huge not only in size, but also in heart. Unlike other animals, they comprehended death, they had rituals to celebrate the birth of a calf or to mourn the loss of a relative. Lions were fierce, tigers were regal, monkeys were smart, peacocks impressive, yet only an elephant could be all of those things at once. Oblivious to his thoughts, Hurrem said, "Show us a few tricks." "Tricks?" Jahan asked. "We don't know any tricks." He could not see the expression on her face, as he could not look up. Instead, he watched her feet, long and shapely, clad in silk slippers, glide a few steps. She came to a halt in front of the elephant and ordered her concubines to fetch a twig. Instantly one was provided. Jahan feared she was going to hit Chota, but she waved it in the air, asking, "Can the beast catch this?" Before the boy could answer, she flung the twig up towards the elephant. It made a crescent in the air, landing near Chota's hind feet. The animal wagged its trunk as if to ward off an invisible fly, and remained still, unruffled. The sultana made a sneering sound. In that instant Jahan saw Chota through her eyes, a massive creature that ate too much, drank too much and, in return, offered nothing. "Are you telling me there's nothing this creature can do?" Hurrem said, less a question than a statement. "Your Majesty, this is a war elephant. So were his grandfathers. He might be young, but he has already proved his bravery on the battlefield." She turned towards him, this boy who was clearly unfamiliar with the ways of the palace. "A warrior, you said?" "Yes, your highness, Chota is a warrior." Even as the words left his mouth, Jahan felt uneasy, already regretting his lie. The sultana took a quiet breath. "Then you are blessed with luck. The war is soon." Hurrem half turned to the chief white eunuch. "Make sure the beast joins our valiant soldiers." She flounced away, her chambermaids and concubines obediently trotting after her. Carnation Camel Aga, after giving the elephant and the mahout each a cold stare, followed them. Not everybody had left, though. Two figures had stayed behind and were now watching the boy, the princess and her nursemaid. "You've upset my lady mother," Miramah said. "Nobody upsets my mother." "I did not intend to," Jahan mumbled on the verge of tears. "Tell me, why are you so upset?" "The elephant does not know how to fight, your highness." "So you lied to my mother?" she asked, less appalled than amused. "Look at me, mahout." No sooner had Jahan glanced at her than he lowered his gaze in shame. In that fleeting instant he had seen her eyes, set wide in her oval face, inherited from her mother, glow with mischief. She said, "You are more of a fool than I thought. Tell me, have you ever been in a war?" He shook his head. From a nearby tree came the squawk of a crow. A loud, harsh cry of warning. "Well, I haven't either. But I have traveled more than my lady mother. Even more than my noble brothers. My venerable father loved me so much he asked me to accompany him to many lands. Just the two of us. A tinge of sorrow crept into her voice. But he doesn't take me anywhere anymore. You are no longer a child, he says. I must be kept away from the eyes of strangers. My brothers are as free as migratory birds. How I wish I had been born a boy. Mystified by this statement, Jahan duly kept his head down. Yet his compliance seemed to annoy her. Look at you and look at me. You are a boy. But you are frightened of the battlefield. I am a girl, but I am dying to go to war with my father. I wish we could exchange places, just for a while. That evening, mustering his courage, Jahan went to see the chief white eunuch. He explained to him Chota was still young and not ready to fight. He blathered on, repeating himself, not because he thought the man hadn't understood but because if he stopped speaking he might begin to cry. What does he need to be ready for? Isn't he a war elephant, the chief white eunuch asked. Or did the Shah deceive us? Oh, he is. But he has not been trained. There are things he's scared of. Like what? The boy swallowed hard. Tigers. I've noticed every time the tiger growls the elephant cowers. I don't know why but in that case, don't fret, Carnation Camel Aga scoffed. There are no tigers in Black Bogdania. Black Bogdania. Jahan echoed. That's where our army is heading. Now get out of my sight and don't come back to me again with such nonsense. It was Olef the lion tamer who came to his aid. He explained to Jahan that an order, once pronounced, must be followed. In whatever time was left they had to train the elephant. If the beast was afraid of tigers, they would have to teach him to overcome his fear. With this purpose, Olef found a tiger skin, God knew from where. Then he asked Sungram to bring a sheep. An innocent animal with blank, brown eyes. They let it graze during the day and kept it in the stable at night. Meanwhile, Olef handed a firkin to one of the kitchen boys, instructing him to fill it with blood the next time a chicken was slaughtered. The following morning, when Chota was out in the yard, Olef asked the same boy to put on the tiger's skin. It was draped round the lad's shoulders, its edges tied around his neck. Olef then instructed him to crawl on all fours around the elephant, growling and snarling. Knock down the bucket. While the boy did as told, the elephant watched this peculiar creature out of the corner of his eye. That day they did not give him food and there was no water. They sharpened his tusks and kept him chained. The second day Olef stuffed the tiger skin with spuds and placed it near Chota's cage. Again there was no food, no treats, just a tad of water. He did not allow him to go out for a walk either. Upset and irked, the elephant kept glancing at the tiger skin, holding it responsible for his misery. The third day Olef brought over the sheep and wrapped the tiger skin on its back. The poor animal tried to shake the thing off, but Olef had smeared the insides with a sticky pine resin. He dragged the sheep in this state into Chota's barn. An hour later the elephant was allowed in. By this time Chota was fraught with hunger and thirst, the sheep crazy with fear. Olef took out the filled firkin. He poured the blood over the sheep, its tiger skin and wool got soaked in red. The smell of blood was sharp, sickening. Olef covered the sheep's head with a cloth. No longer able to see anything, the animal went wild. Its tension infected Chota, who began to stamp his feet. In its daze the sheep ran left and right, eventually ramming into the elephant. Chota swung his trunk, hitting the sheep with tremendous force. The animal toppled over, then recovered, unleashing awful sounds that would haunt Jahan for weeks to come. Trembling, Jahan closed the gate on them. He waited, his ear to the door, holding the handle so hard his fingers ached. He heard the sheep's endless bleating, a blood-curdling wail as if from the bottom of hell. Little by little, all sounds withered away. Gently, they opened the door. It reeked of blood, urine, and excrement. There lay the sheep, lifeless, half-mutilated. That night in the menagerie, Jahan sat with the other tamers around a fire, scented with cedar wood. They talked in hushed tones, the smoke from their water pipes swirling in the air. The Chinese twins, wrapped in a hashish daze, kept chuckling at things unseen. The moon hovered large and low over Istanbul. The sky resembled a sieve of countless holes through which starlight seeped onto the sleeping city. Where there had once been excitement, there was now weariness in Jahan's soul. What was he doing in this garden amid wild animals, apart from his kith and kin? His sisters must be married by now, perhaps had babies each. The thought of them sitting around another fire, one that was so far away it could not warm him, filled his heart with despair. He should be going back home. Instead he was going to war. Friday afternoon, following the prayer, the Sultan gave the command for the sounding of the war drum, a giant circular instrument molded from bronze that was struck 7 times before every campaign. The spine-tingling noise rumbled through the marble halls, the rose gardens and the animals' cages, vibrated through the neighborhoods of rich and poor alike. In front of Jahan's eyes the entire city made ready to do battle. Every mother's son was a soldier of sorts. The Janissaries came out of their barracks. The pashas saddled up their horses. The artisans and the shopkeepers took up arms, as did the gardeners, bakers, cooks, tailors, farriers, furriers, cobblers, potters, weavers, riggers, tanners, chandlers, glaziers, sawyers, stonemasons, coppersmiths, carpenters, tinkers, rope makers, rat catchers, caulkers, fletchers, oarsmen, fishmongers, poulterers and even the soothsayers. In each guild there was a flurry of activity, including in that of the prostitutes. Even so, everyone waited for the chief royal astronomer to announce an auspicious day to launch the war. There was a right time for everything. Celebrations, weddings, circumcisions, warfare. Finally, after nights of watching the stars, the date was fixed. At the end of 20 sunsets the troops would be on their way. Since war meant finding your enemy, unless the enemy found you first, they had to traverse the distance between the Golden Horn and the River Pruth. The elephant and the boy were ordered to march in the front lines. This perturbed Jahan greatly. He did not wish to be that close to the Delabashlar, the crazy heads, clad in furs, tattooed from head to toe, ears pierced, scalps shaved. They were erratic, rough, and savage. Among them were vicious criminals, playing trumpets, blowing horns, banging drums of all sizes and hollering as if to wake the dead. They made a terrible racket certain to chill the enemy's blood and put an elephant into a frenzy. Jahan mulled over how best to reveal his concerns, but as it turned out there was no need. The morning they set off for Black Bogdania, the mad clamour sent Chota into a rage so fierce that he nearly trampled a soldier. Before dusk the 2 of them were moved towards the back rows alongside the cavalry. This time, however, it was the horses that got skittish. In the end they had to be relocated again, next to the corps of footmen. After that things went smoothly. Chota broke into a springy trot, enjoying the open air and the steady march after months of being confined to the palace gardens. From where he sat up on his neck, Jahan could see below and behind. Astonished to find himself staring at a sea of bodies with no end in sight. He saw the camels carrying provisions and the oxen pulling cannons and catapults, the halberdiers of the tresses, with their hair dangling from their caps, the dervishes chanting invocations, the Aga of the Janissaries proudly sitting atop his stallion. The Sultan riding an Arab steed, encircled by guards on both sides, the left-handed archers to his left, the right-handed to his right. In front of him rode a standard-bearer carrying his flag of 7 black horsetails, propping up their banners and horsetails on poles, hoisting lances, scimitars, hatchets, arquebuses, axes, javelins, bucklers, bows, and arrows. Thousands of mortals were forging ahead. Jahan had never seen so many together. The army was less a horde of men than one lump of giant. The beat of feet and hoofs in tandem was hair-raising and stupefying at once. They proceeded uphill against the wind, slicing through the landscape like knife into flesh. Every now and then Jahan jumped off the elephant, deciding to walk for a while. This is how he met a foot soldier, lively as a grig hen, his water-skin slung across his back. When you finish off an enemy, it settles in your gait, the soldier said. For every dastard's head you get a mansion in heaven. Not knowing much about paradise or why he would need houses there, Jahan remained quiet. The foot soldier had fought in the Battle of Mohacs. Droves of infidels had died, falling to the earth like a slew of felled birds. The ground had been strewn with corpses still holding onto their swords. It was raining all the time, but I saw a golden light, he said, dropping his voice to a whisper. What do you mean? Asked Jahan. I swear. It was so bright. It shone upon the field. Allah was on our side. All at once, his words were pierced by a sharp cry of pain. Soldiers ran left and right, barking orders. Murmurs rippled from row to row. Where once was solid ground there was now a large hollow, like an empty eye socket turned towards the skies. The earth had opened up its mouth and swallowed a party of cavalrymen. They had tumbled into a pit with sharpened stakes deep inside, a well-concealed trap left by the enemy. They had died instantly. Only a sable horse was still breathing, gored in the neck, when an archer shot it to end its suffering. A debate ensued as to whether to take the dead out and bury them or leave them where they were. The light was already receding from the horizon. Time being precious, they were laid to rest together, horses and soldiers sharing the same grave. How unfair, Jahan thought, that only the humans would go to heaven, having attained martyrdom, while the animals that accompanied them and died for them were turned away from the gates of paradise. It was a thought he didn't know what to do with and kept to himself. In the days ahead, the army plowed through pearly valleys and rugged hills, making headway with the sun, camping with the dark. In this manner, after 6 dawns and 5 dusks, they reached the banks of the river Pruth. A curtain of fog rolled over the water. There was nothing to convey them to the other shore. No boats, no bridge. They were ordered to set up their tents and get a good rest, while a solution was sought. Bolting towards a bend in the river that had silted up with sludge, Chota threw himself into the pool, wallowing, squelching, trumpeting. Such was his delight that entire regiment stopped to watch him. What is he doing? Said the foot soldier. Covering himself with dirt. Why would he do that? They can't sweat like us, said Jahan. Water keeps them cool. The mud protects them from the sun. Taraz taught me. Who is Taraz? This old tamer in the palace, said Jahan nonchalantly. He knows everything about every animal. The foot soldier studied him with a glint in his eyes. So you learned about the elephant's ways from this Taraz. Why didn't you know about your own beast? Jahan evaded his gaze, suddenly uneasy. He had said too much. Every time he allowed someone, anyone, to prise open the shell of his soul, he repented of it. Instantly. Soon it became obvious that Chota was the only one benefiting from the hiatus. Endlessly waiting by the river didn't go down well with the Janissaries, who longed for victory and loot. The wind that had lashed at their faces during the march had abated, but now there were swarms of mosquitoes everywhere. They stung with a vengeance, as if they had been trained by the enemy. The soldiers were tense, the horses fidgety. The foragers were tired of raking through the same villages for food, and the soup tasted blander by the day. In the meantime, a corps of workers had begun building a bridge. They seemed to be doing a fine job, when, unexpectedly shoved by Shaitan, first one, then the rest of the piers collapsed. Before the week was over, the foundations of a second bridge had been laid, though thicker and sturdier than the first. Its abutment crumbled even faster, wounding half a dozen soldiers and killing one. The third bridge was only a weak attempt. The soil was too boggy, the river's current relentless. Disheartened and bone-weary, they fell into a torpor that sucked them down like the marsh beneath their feet. Jahan didn't even need to ask the foot soldier what he thought about their predicament. He knew he would say that the Almighty, who had brought them all the way into this bleak landscape, had suddenly forgotten them. If things went on like this, before the war had even started, the Ottoman army would be defeated by its own impatience. The master. By the river Prut they waited. The water ran wild and deep between the Ottoman army and the enemy. The Janissaries itched to be on the other shore. A thirst for victory. One morning, Jahan saw the Zemburg Sabasi * hurrying as fast as his legs would carry him, coming in his direction. Eager to learn what was going on, he was late in moving out of the man's way. How is the beast doing, Mahout? Asked the Zemburg Sabasi, quickly righting himself after their minor collision. He is very well, Effendi, ready to fight soon, inshallah. First we need to cross this cursed river. And with those words the man disappeared into a hefty tent that had two soldiers outside standing sentinel. Jahan should have stopped there, but he didn't. Not pausing to think whose tent this could be, he walked with such steadiness that the guards took him to be the attendant of the Zemburg Sabasi and let him pass. Inside, it was so crowded nobody paid the boy any attention. Quiet as a mouse, Jahan tiptoed to a corner opposite the door, squeezing in between two pages. Cloth walls, brocade cushions, carpets of dazzling colors, salvers piled high with delicacies, braziers, lanterns, incenses with sweet fragrances. He wondered if he could filch a few things for Captain Gareth, but even the thought of that was terrifying. The Grand Vizier was there, a heron's plume attached to his turban. The Sultan was at the far end, clad in an amber kaftan, dignified as a sculpture. He sat on a bejeweled throne set upon risers, a position that allowed him to study. The Shaykh al-Islam, the Janissary Aga and the other viziers had lined up on either side of him, offering comments. They were discussing whether or not to alter their route, in order to find a bend in the river where the ground would be hard enough to build a bridge. This not only meant losing weeks, perhaps as much as a month, but also the favorable weather. "My gracious lord," Lutfi Pasha said, "there's someone who can build us a strong bridge." When the Sultan demanded who that might be, Lutfi Pasha said, "One of your elite guards. Sinan is his name, your Hasaki * slave." Before long a man was ushered in. He kneeled down, merely steps away from where Jahan stood. He had a wide forehead, chiseled nose, and dark, somber eyes that exuded calmness. Asked to come forward, he proceeded slowly, lowering his head, as if against a gusty wind. After listening to why he had been summoned, Sinan said, "My felicitous Sultan, we shall have a bridge, Allah willing." "How many days, by your reckoning, would be needed to complete it?" asked Sultan Sulayman. Sinan paused, though not for long. 10, my lord." "What makes you think you will succeed when others have failed?" "My lord, the others, with pure intentions no doubt, began the construction. Straight away I shall build the bridge in my mind. Only after that will I have it set in stone." Strange though the answer was, it seemed to please the Sultan. Sinan was given the task. He went back the way he had come, unhurried. As he passed Jahan, he took a look at the boy's face and then did something Jahan had not seen any man of his rank do before. He smiled. It was then that a thought occurred to the boy. If he worked with this man, he could get close to Sultan Sulayman's riches. Everyone said the sovereign had brought chests full of coins and jewels to distribute to those who demonstrated great courage on the battlefield. "Effendi, wait," Jahan yelled once he had sneaked out, catching up with the architect. "I am the elephant's tamer." "I know who you are," said Sinan. "I have seen you take care of the beast. Chota is stronger than 40 soldiers. He could be of great help to you." "Well, do you know anything about construction?" We worked with a master mason in Hindustan." Holding the boy's eyes in his stare, Sinan gave this some thought. "What were you doing in the Grand Vizier's tent?" "I slipped in on the sly," said Jahan, this time telling the truth. The lines around Sinan's eyes softened. "An elephant could prove useful. A bright, inquisitive boy like yourself might help, too." Jahan felt his cheeks burn. In all his time in the world he could not recall anyone having called him bright. And, just like that, the elephant and the mahout joined the army of stonemasons and began working with this stranger called Sinan. Keen as the laborers were to put their backs into the work, the first day went by without anyone moving a finger. So did the second. Sinan seemed to be dawdling, walking back and forth along the river, staring into the distance, poking canes into the water, taking measurements, carrying scrolls of paper, scribbling numbers, drawing shapes no less obscure than those on an oracle's charts. The soldiers were starting to get nervous, asking what on earth they were waiting for. At nights in the tents and around the fires, rumor had it that Sinan was clearly not the right man for the task. On the third day Sinan announced they would start construction. To everyone's surprise he had chosen a site 2 Donum * up the shoreline, where the river was wider. When asked why he was taking them that far, he said a bridge could be short or long, that didn't matter, but its foundations had to be as strong as granite. Chota carried wooden frames and planks. He moved rocks into place so as to protect the structure from the force of the current. That he could plod in the river easily proved to be opportune. In the fast-flowing water that reached up to their chins he was a great asset. They used massive, watertight barrels, each of which had been sealed inside with clay mortar and lowered into a newly dug hole. Covered in mud, sweat, and dirt, Jahan toiled alongside the laborers. Strange men they were. Tough and taciturn, but yet caring towards one of their own. They would put their right hand on their heart whenever they heard someone mention the prophets Seth and Abraham, the patron saints of stonemasons and architects. Among them, Jahan felt more at ease than he ever had anywhere. Like them, he found a secret joy in raising stone upon stone. 10 days after Sinan had been entrusted with the job, they finished the bridge. Seated on his horse, the Sultan was the first to cross, holding the reins tightly in one hand. The Grand Vizier followed, then the others, including Lutfi Pasha, who congratulated himself on having found the architect. Once the royal entourage reached the opposite bank, everyone rejoiced. The whole army began to traverse the bridge, 6 men at a time. Here and there prayers were heard. Men unafraid of bloodshed but terrified of water. When it was their turn, Jahan and Chota made a move, but they were stopped by the Subashi. The beast ought to wait. He's too heavy. It was Sinan who came to their rescue. Effendi, this bridge can carry 50 elephants if need be. The Subashi grunted his approval. If you say so. Turning to Jahan, Sinan said, "Come, I'll walk with you." Thus they crossed the bridge together, the elephant lumbering behind them. Once on the other shore, Sinan was called urgently. He quickened his steps. Having not been told to stay behind, Jahan followed, and so did Chota. Ahead of them the notables were having a debate over what would happen to the bridge after the army left. From their expressions Jahan saw that things had become tense. Lutfi Pasha wanted to construct a watchtower and detail a regiment to guard the bridge. The Grand Vizier and the Governor-General of Rumlia, Sofa Mehmet Pasha, disagreed. Unable to reach an agreement, they had decided to consult the architect. "My lords, if we build a tower, the enemy will capture both the tower and the bridge," said Sinan. "They can ambush us from behind." "What do you suggest?" the Grand Vizier asked. "We made it with our hands, we can destroy it with our hands," Sinan replied. "Then we can build a new bridge on our return." Lutfi Pasha, who, because he had recommended Sinan to the Divan, expected obedience from him, became furious. "Coward! You are scared you'll be left behind to guard the tower." Sinan paled, but when he spoke he sounded placid. "My lords, I'm a Janissary. If the Sultan orders me to raise a tower and to guard it, I shall do as he says. But you have asked my honest opinion, and this I gave." Into the ensuing silence the Governor-General said, "Well, the Arabs have been burning their ships. This is not a ship and we are not Bedouins." Lutfi Pasha snapped, throwing a cold glance in Sinan's direction. The meeting came to an end without a solution being reached. Later in the afternoon, the Sultan, who had been informed of the argument, announced his decision. Apparently, he had favored Sinan's suggestion over Lutfi Pasha's. The bridge was to be demolished. Destroying a bridge was easier than building it, Jahan soon found out. Yet it pained him to see the stones they had toiled so hard to gather and carefully position now come tumbling down. He disagreed with Sinan more than anyone. How could the man recommend wrecking the bridge, as if the sweat of their brows meant nothing to him? When he found his chance to talk to Sinan, Jahan began by floundering. "Effendi, forgive me. I don't understand why we are doing this. We work so hard. We shall work harder the next time." "Yes, but how could you so easily say, 'Let's knock it down'? Doesn't it make you sad?" Sinan regarded the boy as if they had already known one another in a different time. He said, "My first master was my father. He was the best carpenter in the region, and he was the one who trained me from boyhood. Every Zadik asterisk he'd fast for 40 days. Meanwhile he would ask me to carve a lamb out of wood. Then he'd tell me it was not good enough and take it from me. I have destroyed it? He'd later say, go make another one. I resented this, but my lambs got better. Jahan's back tightened as he thought about his stepfather. He recalled how once the man had scoffed at the furnace he had built in the backyard for his mother. Now, years later, he was not surprised to see that the anger he had felt back then was still entrenched deep in his heart. Oblivious to his thoughts, Sinan continued, when my father passed away, we found a chest in his shed. Inside were all the lambs that I had carved as a boy. Father had kept every one of them. I understand he made you a better craftsman, but he wounded you. Sometimes, for the soul to thrive, the heart needs to be broken, son. I don't understand, Effendi. I wouldn't want anyone to waste my work. In order to gain mastery, you need to dismantle as much as you put together. Then there'd be no buildings left in the world, Jahan ventured. Everything would be razed to the ground. We are not destroying the buildings, son. We are destroying our desire to possess them. Only God is the owner of the stone and of the skill. I don't understand, said Jahan again, albeit this time not as loudly. Thus, on the bank of the river Pruth, they left behind them their sweat, their faith and their work, lying in ruins that gave no clue as to what an exquisite bridge had once stood in that place. It was the night before the battle, not the nights afterwards, that would stay etched on Jahan's soul, when he was still complete, still unbroken, and would have remained so had this been a different world. Jahan had been lying on his pallet thinking of Miramah. He couldn't help it. His eyes acted on their own. Seeing her combing her hair, or strolling through the rose gardens, her smile everywhere. His ears heard her voice. He was powerless as his senses conjured her out of the air. After sunset the mood in the camp began to shift, and restlessness settled in. By the time darkness had completely descended there was a kind of anticipation in the wind, so intense as to be tangible. All the soldiers in the camp, no matter how high or low in the echelons, knew deep in their hearts that the star-filled sky they looked at could be their last. Tomorrow, when the sun was up and the enemy was within sniffing distance, none of them would hesitate in doing what they had to do. But now they found themselves dangling in a limbo between faith and doubt, bravery and cowardice, loyalty and betrayal. A feeling of foreboding tore at their nerves. It wasn't this bleak, doomed valley where they wished to die, their bodies picked apart by vultures, their bones left without a headstone and their ghosts wandering till eternity. They would rather be buried in a tranquil graveyard, dotted with cypress trees and roses in bloom, where the soil was familiar, where people knew their names and would say a prayer or two for their souls. The promise of victory and loot was sweet, yet life was sweeter. Many secretly pondered saddling up a horse and breaking loose, as if, being unable to return home, they could now go anywhere. Despite the sounding of the night drum, the soldiers found it hard to fall asleep. Murmurs percolated inside tents as stories were shared, secrets revealed, promises made, prayers uttered. Walking past a marquee that belonged to the bombardiers, Jahan came across a grenade thrower singing in a strange language. The Janissaries were from myriad backgrounds, sons of the Balkans, and Anatolia among them. Memories of their previous lives had been locked inside caskets, the keys thrown away. Still, at times like these, when they stood face to face with death, the caskets opened of their own accord and released fragments of their childhood, like a dream they had once had but couldn't piece together. On the pretext of fetching food for the elephant, Jahan rambled around the camp with a bucket in his hand. He came across dervishes whirling in circles. Within circles, their right hands open towards the sky, their left hands turned towards the earth, receiving and giving, dead to everyone and yet perhaps more alive than many. He watched pious Muslims praying on tiny rugs, a faint mark on their foreheads from all their kneeling. He met an armorer who kept a scorpion in a box in his sash, which, he said, would sting him should he fall captive to the idolaters. He overheard Janissaries cursing under their breath, a row between mates that would be forgotten tomorrow morning. He saw prostitutes who, even though they had been forbidden to work the day before the battle, prowled among the tents. Tonight of all nights was the most lucrative, since many a man would need their comfort. Ahead of him were three whores, their faces half hidden under their capes. Curious, as always, Jahan began to follow them. One woman, young, slender, and dressed as a Jewess, stopped and glanced back. "Brave soldier," she said silkily, "you couldn't sleep." "I'm not a soldier," said Jahan. "But you are brave, I am sure." Jahan shrugged, not knowing how to respond. Her smile grew broader. "Let me look at you." At her touch Jahan flinched. She put her arm through his, clutching his hand with so tight a grip that he could not pull away. Her fingers were soft, her body smelled of wood smoke and damp grass. Trying to hide the shudder that had seized him, Jahan pulled himself free. "Don't go," she pleaded like a heartbroken lover. The request was so unexpected and so innocent, he was nonplussed. When he began to walk, she trotted behind him, the swish of her skirts reminding him of the sound of pigeons ruffling their feathers under the eaves. Staring ahead, as if the night held a riddle he had to solve, Jahan continued onwards. It was getting late, and moving around a camp with a whore on his heels was dangerous. Reluctantly, he headed to his tent. There were 3 stable grooms inside. "Hey, Indian lad, what did you bring us?" one of them asked. "A gazelle, eh?" "She came on her own," Jahan said scathingly. For a moment they were silent, considering what to do. The eldest groom, who had a fine pair of boots with which to trade, took the whore to his bed. Jahan, feigning indifference, retreated to a corner and unrolled his pallet. Sleep would not come. His face set into a grimace as he listened to the grunts, the panting. When he thought it was finally over, he propped up on one elbow and glanced around. By a candle's weak glow he saw them, he rocking on top of her, she lying limp and listless, her eyes wide open and fixed on the shadow of something that wasn't there. She turned to one side. Their gazes locked. In her eyes he glimpsed her universe, in her loneliness he recognized his own. He felt ill, dizzy, the ground tilting beneath his weight. At that moment Jahan discovered, against his better judgment, a wild power smoldering in his heart. There was a dark side to his nature, a secret cellar under the house of his soul that he had not yet visited but always sensed existed. He jumped to his feet, stomping towards the groom, who didn't notice him until it was too late. He shoved him off her and hit him hard, a punch that sent the man tumbling to the floor, though in truth it hurt Jahan's hand more than the man's chin. The groom, less furious than perplexed, blinked back up at the boy. His lips twisted in disdainful recognition of what had happened until he emitted a chuckle. The other grooms joined in. Jahan looked at the whore and saw that she, too, was laughing at him. Trembling, he slipped outside the tent, in need of seeing Chota, who was always sweet-tempered and tender-hearted, and, unlike human beings, knew no arrogance or malice. As usual, the elephant was dozing on his feet. Every day he slept no more than a few hours. While Jahan changed his water and checked his food, his mind was awash with images of the whore, her touching him, her following him, her sprawled on a dirty mattress, half naked. Yet, when he lay down on a pile of straw and closed his eyes, it was Miramah who appeared, once again, leaning towards him in a kiss. He opened his eyes in panic, embarrassed for daring to think of her in that way, a woman of noble birth, not like that ruined harlot from nowhere. Still, try as he might, he could neither banish the harlot nor stop dreaming of the princess. Next morning at dawn he woke with the sound of prayer. The grooms were up and ready. Jahan searched them for a trace of guilt or a sign of fatigue. Nothing. It was as if the night before had never happened. Slow and tedious the prelude to war had been, the battle itself was swift, or so it felt to Jahan. He heard a rumbling echo, first far off, then too close. The enemy was no longer an obscure shadow, it had a face, 1,000 faces, in fact, peering from under their helmets. Atop his elephant Jahan raked his gaze across the battlefield. In the distance, where the two armies were colliding, the colors melted into a cascade of gray. Sparks of light flashed and died, as blades struck against each other. Everywhere he turned he saw metal and flesh, spears, swords and knives, bodies hurling across the plain, staggering, falling. The sound was deafening. The clatter of iron-shod hooves, the clash of steel, the thwack of catapults, the yelling, the choking, the constant repetition of Allah. Allah. They fought for the Sultan. They fought for the Almighty. But also for every wrong they had suffered since they were boys, the whips and sticks and blows they had endured. Blood soaked into blood on patches of earth that turned so dark as to be black. Their cheeks puffing, their mouths foaming, the horses galloped, their riders standing in the saddles. Clouds of smoke billowed far and wide. Though it was mid-afternoon, the light was already receding, the sky a mantle of smoke. Bewildered, flustered, Chota clumped left and right, uneasy under the huge plate armor, which he had still not got used to. His tusks had been honed into sharp blades. Jahan tried talking to him, but his words were swallowed up by the clamor. In the periphery of his vision he caught a movement. A hefty Frank, crossbow over his shoulder, lurched forward upon a Janissary, who, having tripped over and dropped his javelin, lay on the ground, momentarily confused. The Janissary ducked the first lunge of the sword, but the next one pierced his shoulder. In an instant Jahan steered Chota in their direction. The elephant barged into the Frank and lifted him up in the air, with his tusk jammed into his abdomen. That's enough, Chota, Jahan yelled. Let go. The elephant obeyed, for a fleeting moment, dropping the screaming soldier. But instantly he hauled him up again, thrusting his tusk into his chest. Blood spurted from the man's mouth, a look of disbelief in his eyes at meeting his end at the hands of an animal. Jahan watched terrified, only now realizing he had not been commanding Chota, Chota had been commanding him. After that, Jahan felt more and more like a spectator. Chota propelled himself towards enemy lines, picking, hoisting and dropping off soldiers. He crushed 2 Franks under his weight. With one soldier he took longer, like a cat with a mouse, as if he wished him to suffer longer. He attacked a Janissary, 2, not making any distinction between friend and foe. It was sheer luck that saved the man from being trampled. Yes, the battle happened quickly, though afterwards Jahan would relieve it in his head 1,000 times. The deaths he had witnessed but did not see, the cries he had caught but did not hear, would rush back to him. Even decades later, as an old man, Jahan would find himself remembering that afternoon, a blood-stained shield in the mud, a burning arrow with lumps of flesh attached, a horse split open, and, somewhere, behind the veil of time, always, the face of the prostitute, laughing at him. Further off, amid the sea of flames, he saw a soldier tottering, his face a carved mask, his midriff gored with a spear. Jahan recognized the foot soldier, whom he had befriended on the way. "Halt, Chota," he shouted. "Put me down." Both orders the elephant disobeyed. Without thinking, Jahan threw himself off the animal's back, dropping heavily on his side. He reached the foot soldier, who, by now, had fallen down onto his knees. His fingers were entwined, as if grabbing an invisible rope. Blood gurgled out from his nose, a few drops spilling on the talisman around his neck. Jahan took off his mahout jacket and pressed it on the wound, from which the head of the spear poked out. He sat beside him, holding his hand between his palms, the man's pulse a fading drum. The foot soldier broke into a smile. It was impossible to say whether this was because he was relieved to see a familiar face or because he thought Jahan was someone else. His teeth chattering, he stammered something incomprehensible. Bending over, Jahan listened, his breath warm against the man's cheek. "The light, did you see?" Jahan gave a tight nod. "I have. It's beautiful." A shadow of solace flitted across the foot soldier's face. His body grew heavy. His mouth sagged, his eyes remained open as though fixed on a cloud that had already passed. Later on, when everything was over and the Ottoman army had triumphed, Jahan could not bring himself to join the revelry. Trudging wearily, he drifted away from the camp into the heart of the battleground. It was a reckless thing to do. He had no weapon on him other than a dagger he wasn't sure he could use. Still, he lumbered across the valley shrouded in mist, pushing on through the field strewn with bodies that only a few hours before had been sons, husbands or brothers. He had the feeling that this place with its shadows and smoke was the end of the known earth, and that if he kept walking he would fall off the edge. He knew Chota would be starving, waiting for him to bring food and water. But the last thing he wanted was to see the elephant. A few times he stepped on a soft mound here and there, and found out, to his horror, that it was a dead man's thigh or a severed hand. The stench was fierce. The lingering sounds were eerie, the crackle of burning wood, the hoofbeats of riderless horses and, from corners he could not make out, the moans of soldiers still alive. The pain, when it finally caught him, was like nothing he had experienced before. He checked himself over, unable to find anything. It was in his head, in his limbs. He couldn't tell where it ached, for the pain traveled, now eating at his bones, now clenching his insides. Hunched up, he vomited. Drawn by a mad instinct, he picked his way through the field, his feet sore, his legs heavy like timber, his forehead beaded with sweat, until he found an old, gnarled tree to sit by. A troop of Ottoman miners was excavating a huge pit in the distance. When they were done, they would separate out the dead, and bury their own. What would happen to the corpses of the Franks, he didn't know. So engrossed was he in his thoughts that he did not hear anyone approaching. "Indian lad," came a voice from behind. "What are you doing here?" Gasping, Jahan turned around. Master Sinan. You should not be here, son. It didn't occur to the boy that neither should Sinan. He said, apologetically. Don't want to go back. The man inspected the boy's swollen eyes, his marred face. Slowly, he sat down next to him. The sun was setting, a crimson tinge on the horizon. A flock of storks flew over, heading towards warmer lands. Jahan started to cry. Taking a blade out of his sash, Sinan chipped a chunk from a log nearby. As he carved, he began talking about Agirnas, the village where he had been born. The hedged crop fields, the Greek and Armenian churches with no bells, and the icy winds that hummed like sad songs, the yogurt soup his mother made and served cold in the summer, hot in the winter, the carpentry his father had taught him, where even the tiniest piece of wood was breathing and alive. Becoming a Janissary and converting to Islam when he was 21, he had joined the hearth of Hasi Betesh, named for the dervish patron of the Janissary Corps, and taken part in war after war, Rhodes, Belgrade, Iran, Corfu, Baghdad and, the bloodiest of them all, Mohacs. He had seen the bravest turn tail, the timid bloom into lion hearts. My elephant, said Jahan when he could find his voice. Olef and I taught him how to kill. Now he has killed many. Sinan stopped carving. Don't be upset at the animal. Don't blame yourself. The boy shivered, suddenly cold. When we made that bridge, I felt useful. Effendi. I wish we had stayed there. When you do things from your soul, you feel a river moving in you, a joy. Who said this? A poet, a wise man. Sinan placed his hand on the boy's forehead. It was hot. Tell me, would you like to build more? Yes, I'd like that very much, Jahan replied. When darkness descended, they headed back to the camp. Halfway there they came across a saddled horse trotting around on its own, its rider gone. Sinan made Jahan sit on the horse, and led it by the reins back to camp. He took Jahan to his tent and told the grooms to take care of the elephant while the boy got some rest. Burning with fever, Jahan fell into a painful slumber as soon as he lay down. Sinan stayed beside him, putting vinegar-soaked cloths on his face and arms, and continuing with his carving. At dawn, when Jahan's temperature dropped, Sinan opened the boy's clenched fist, placed the gift upon his palm and left. The next morning, when the boy woke up, drenched in sweat but otherwise fine, he found himself holding a wooden elephant. On its face, instead of sharp, lethal tusks, it had two flowers. The city was awaiting its army. Since sunrise people had been pouring out, filling the streets and squares like thick, gooey shurub asterisk climbing up on trees, perching on roofs, squeezing into every smidgen of space alongside the road. From Adrianople Gate to the palace, thousands were eager to welcome the victors. Istanbul, with its serpentine alleys, underground passages, and closed bazaars, had donned her best gown and was, for once, all smiles. The soldiers recomin, exclaimed an urchin who had planted himself above a fountain. His words, ripples on the surface of a pond, spread out, reaching the shores of the crowd and from there pushing back towards the center, altered along the way. By the time the same child heard the echo of his exclamation, it sounded rather different, the sultans given out coins. Townsmen with joy and pride in their hearts, merchants with pouches sewn into their hems, liver vendors with strips of meat hanging from poles and stray cats on their heels, Sufis with the 99 names of God on their tongues, scribes with ink stains on their fingers, beggars with bowls dangling from their necks, pickpockets with hands as nimble as squirrels, travelers from Frangistan, with a startled look, and Venetian spies with honeyed words and astute smiles. Everyone inched closer, keen to see. In a little while, the Sultan's elite guards passed under an arched gateway in full regalia, leading the cavalcade down the acacia-lined thoroughfare, their horses at a ceremonial trot. Following them, mounted on a purebred Arabian stallion, clad in an azure kaftan and a turban so high as to confuse a passing stork on the lookout for a nest, was Suleiman the Magnificent. A collective gasp rose from the audience and mingled with prayers and adulations. Rose petals danced in the air, sprinkled from 100 windows and balconies. Behind rows and rows of armor-clad soldiers, some marching, some riding, some pulling their horses by the reins, came the elephant and the mahout. Initially Jahan had been ordered to sit on the animal's neck and leave the howdah to the Janissary Aga. After a few steps in this way, however, the man had asked to be brought down, his face ashen. Accustomed as he was to tempestuousness of all kinds, the elephant's sway proved too much for the Ottoman nobleman. Hence Jahan ensconced himself inside the howdah in the manner of an exiled prince returning home after years abroad. The feeling was strangely sweet. For the first time in days he forgot about the battleground and the stench of death that still wafted from his skin. Soon it became apparent that the white elephant would be the center of attention. No one, other than the Sultan, received so much applause and admiration. People everywhere were pointing at Chota, waving, laughing, clapping. A clothier flung strings of ribbons, a gypsy lass sent a kiss, giggling, a guttersnipe fell down from the branch on which he had climbed, trying to touch the beast's tusks. As Chota sped along, swinging his tail left and right, buoyed by the warm reception, Jahan glided on in a daze of his own. Never had he felt so important, wrapped in the delicious fancy that his presence in the city, if not in this world, filled a unique void. With his cheeks flushed in gratification, he waved back at the spectators. In the menagerie, Chota was greeted like a hero. It was decided that he would not be sent to the other menageries in the city. He would stay here in the seraglio. His daily ration was doubled and he was allowed to take a bath, every week, in the lily-covered pond at the far end of the courtyard, a privilege that no other wild animal was given. None of the others were permitted to leave the menagerie. Gradually Jahan forgave the elephant for the way he had behaved on the battleground. He covered his knife-like tusks with 2 silken balls, and made a new mantle for him with his own hands. He garnished the trims with silver bells, and sewed on blue beads against the evil eye. Languid and placid sunset slipped by. Blissful days these were, though, as too often happens with blissful days. They would be appreciated only when they were no more. Several days later, while Jahan was cleaning out the barn, Olef the lion tamer appeared by his side. He said, "Someone sent you a message." "Who?" Jahan asked, a crack in his voice.